Well, good morning, good morning. My name is Becky Metcalfe, and on behalf of Design Centre Chelsea Harbour, a very warm welcome to London Design Week. A little bit of housekeeping first of all. If I could ask everybody to turn their phones off, that would be really kind. Well, what a way to start our Conversation in Design series with such a brilliant session. We're delighted this has been sponsored by JLL, so thank you to them, and also for supporting the whole of London Design Week. And we really do have a starry panel. We've got Richard Parr, Claire Saar, and Natalia Meyer. And who better to speak to them about the marriage of architecture and interior design than Charlotte Abrams? Should we give them a very warm welcome?
Thanks, Becky. And it's absolute joy to be here in person, finally, talking to three leading creatives about how architects and interior designers navigate the invisible line between those two very interrelated fields. So Claire, Richard, Natalia, welcome. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves. So Natalia, quick elevator pitch.
Elevator pitch. Good morning, everyone. I'm Natalia Meyer. I am the founder and creative director of Natalia Meyer Atelier. We are an interior architecture and design practice based in London and in the US as well. And I'm very lucky I get to work on beautiful residential and hospitality projects all around the world. And I'm delighted to be here this morning with all of you.
Thank you. Richard.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Parr. Our practice is Richard Parr & Associates. We are architects specialising in residential work, spread both between town and country projects. And our sort of tagline is modern traditionalists, which we apply to our practice.
My name's Claire Saar. I'm co-director of DeRosa Saar Architects. We are predominantly an architectural practice based in London with an office in Lisbon and in Brussels. And we have a growing interior kind of side to our studio. And we like to sort of think that we have a design approach rather than a design style. Our projects are varied, but mostly residential.
Thank you. So, to begin with, let's get the sort of definition of what architecture and interior design, and then this third area of interior architecture are. Claire, do you want to start? How would you define those three?
So, I think there is a nuanced sort of definition, and it's very hard to draw the line. I used to explain to clients that if I was to shake the house, everything that would fall out would be interiors, and everything that stuck would be architecture. But I found that sort of analogy harder and harder to use, because what then happens with paint color or paneling or floor materials. So I think there's a spectrum of definitions. I think perhaps traditionally architecture might have been shell and core and technical, and then everything else that comes inside was interiors. But I think the definition is changing, and in different countries it is also sometimes, unclear.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Richard, how would you do those?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you. This concept of shaking a building and everything falls out used to be perceived as interior, and what was left was the architecture. I don't think that's quite the case for us, because we're very involved in curating experiences and lifestyles and client journeys. So the creation of a house is about, it starts on the outside, and especially a lot of our work is positioning houses in landscapes. And so it starts with the spirit of the place, and it works inwards through the architecture and naturally infuses into the interior. And I agree with you that there is a lot that doesn't drop out that is actually could be perceived as interior design, which we also do, which is why this match thing is quite an interesting question.
Natalia.
I mean, I would agree with both of those points. I think the technical part is really where a lot of people see the difference. Architects being more in charge of how things actually work. But I think if a good designer didn't know how things worked, then it's not a very good design after all, and everything seems to literally fall apart. So, in my practice, we focus more on interior architecture, even though as an architect, I'd be happy to do the whole building, but because it's what I prefer to do, more than what we can do. But again, I think the best collaborations are when you don't see them as three different components, but you have this unified vision for the project, And I think the great thing about working with an architect that has a creative vision is that you can visualize that completion from the beginning.
Okay. So, does it matter? I mean, this question, is it? Here we are discussing it, so clearly it does matter. But why? Open question.
Sorry, does it matter?
Does what matter?
Does this definition matter? Do we need to know that there is a difference between?
Well, I think what is important is to define roles in a project, and we are talking about different areas of expertise. And I think what's interesting here, you've actually got a discussion about interior design and architecture, but you've got 3 architects sitting on the panel, and we're all very different. And I think defining that line where one thing stops and where another area of expertise begins is actually what makes a successful project.
Yeah.
And I'm the first to sort of accept that there are things other people are better at doing, furniture and a lot of that sort of the things you touch, the things you move around is probably not what I'm best at doing when I have done it, but it's so I really focus on what I'm good at doing. So when I work with interior designers, it's really great when they come along and bring another layer.
Yeah.
If I could just make one more point also, I think the whole process is often very long, and it's quite interesting to have different people who join the process because it refreshes the project as you go through.
And I think sometimes also the scale of the project and the client can define the necessity for lots of roles. Obviously, if it's a small-scale residential project where the client has a sort of quite, you may negate the need for 4 or 5 different, interior design or designers or different consultants. But perhaps if you're doing a bigger scale project, having clearly defined roles, or if the client's vision is perhaps more commercially driven, then that also might justify breaking it up, perhaps.
Okay. It's really interesting, as you say, that the 3 of you are all trained architects, but you've taken different routes since. Let's just find out why that was in Italia. Why do you trained as an architect, but you now describe yourself as?
I say we do interior architecture and design. When I'm asked what I am, I call myself an architect because that's my training and that's what I do. I struggle when I'm referred to as an interior designer because I don't recognize myself. But for me, I don't think it was as deliberate as the fact that, I moved to a new country. I moved to the UK 15 years ago after practicing architecture in the US for a number of years, and I found the role of the architect here, at least the ones I encountered in the first projects, to feel very technical. And I'm a very creative person. And so I was naturally drawn to projects where I could influence the interiors more. And, I'm not saying mine is the normal or a path, it happened to be my path. And I love collaborating with other architects because of what Richard said. You have an influx of ideas from other people. I'm good at a number of things. I'm not good at everything. And I think design and architecture is such a collaborative process. I mean, of course, there's the architecture and then there's the implementation. That's construction. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But, for me, I see my work mostly through my eyes as an architect with my architectural training, and what I do with fabrics and furniture, which I absolutely love and I think is essential to creating that unified space, is just so fun for me. I didn't think it could be a job. I grew up thinking work had to be a little harder. So I guess I took many more years of study to get to where I am now.
And Richard, why architecture is what you do?
Well, actually, I've always wanted to be an architect, and I've always enjoyed buildings. And I think above all, I really enjoy creating spaces and creating experiences and all those aspects of somebody's lifestyle. And I think it's a very wide subject, and I enjoy sort of creating things that are going to last. So that whole idea of legacy is very, very important to us. And I think Natalia's point about moving here from the US, where actually everything is built, because actually if it's not right, you tear it down, you build something else. Whereas here we've got an amazing sort of richness in housing stock, or every site has been used before. There's always something. So I think as an architect, one has to get used to accepting some things that are there, be it a piece of landscape, be it a street, be it just 2 side walls and an elevation. So for me, that I don't find that restricting. But I can see from Natalia's point of view, actually, particularly in London, and I think there's a difference here between London and outside London, where you've got more space. And it's why I think my practice has gravitated to creating a lot of country houses, because they're slower to produce, but actually it gives us way more opportunity, because we can then, I mean, now we're working from Suffolk to Sussex to West Country, and there's an image behind us on the screen of a project in Oxfordshire, and we draw out of those local places, local materials, but reinterpret them. And I think that allows us to do exactly what you were probably missing coming from the States. We are now creating those one-off pieces of legacy architecture.
And where does your role stop?
Funnily enough, it doesn't really stop. It overlaps. But I think it's very important to know where that boundary lies. And I think the boundary can be a little bit blurred if the design team have the same values and the same ethos. So working with an interior designer who understands how we've got to that point on the journey. I mean, some of our projects are built and they're given permission because they are deemed of architectural excellence. Well, that then has to carry all the way through. And we very much see ourselves as curators of that lifestyle and curators of those buildings. And so somebody joining the team can get really excited about being part of it, but not against it, because then it's not going to work. So I feel I own those buildings, but then I hand them over. And but then I go back, and there are always other things to be changed. I mean, a building is an ongoing process. It's not just finite, especially if it's going to last hundreds of years.
And Claire, your practice does both, so you get the whole, you don't have to stop at any point.
No, but I mean, like Richard and Natalia, I trained as an architect, and sometimes I come into places like the design centre, and I feel like an imposter because I think I don't know enough about the curtains and the pelmets but it was so very hard for me when I sort of you take on a new project and you visualize what this project, or when you're sketching, it's very hard to not visualize what is the atmosphere of this place going to be, what's it going to feel like in the evening with the lights on, also what is the garden going to feel. I mean, I sometimes have to stop myself from sort of starting a kind of landscape kind of corner in the office as well, but it just feels natural that when you're visualizing a project, that your sort of end goal or what you're trying to create is in your sort of, periphery of your vision, whether you're doing that interior design component or not, and that is sometimes driven by the client. But it just felt very natural to want to then take that on, because it gave a lot more meaning to the architecture when you're designing floor plans or volumes or space or space planning and flow. It was so important that how it was going to be either painted or decorated or used was very much fed into that initial conceptual conversation. So we almost couldn't stop ourselves from wanting to sort of then do the next bit. And some clients, and this is where it is sometimes driven by the clients, will want you to do that. And some clients will see the great value in having you being part of that conversation if they think you're, trust you and are competent. Some sometimes arrive with an interior designer, and then you have to sort of collaborate. I mean, the collaboration is also very good, successful result. I think what is often less successful is when an architect is commissioned and the building and design is almost, and then a sort of, if it is a sort of separate interior team, come on at the later stages, because then you're slightly sort of trying to put a bit of gloss on something that's already been preconceived and built, and I think that is less successful. So an integral approach to the two, whether it's in-house or not, is, I generally think, much more successful.
So how do you do that? If with your practice, you're all there, but with you, Richard, I mean it's right, isn't it? And then there's a distinction between interior design and interior decoration, and I think what we're talking about here is interior design, which is equally about volumes and light and space and those more structural things. So how do you work with an interior designer who comes in?
The way we work is, the journey we take our clients on is generally quite a long one. So we're actually defining the way that they are going to live, not now, not next year, but maybe 5 years or 10 years, or when their children leave. I mean, these buildings have a long life, and I think that there are lots of other issues that come into play, not just what the client's aspirations might be, but actually what our sort of moral responsibility is on materiality, for example, sustainability. So we work alongside interior designers a lot, but actually that sort of layering on top of what we've done and in spite of what we've done is always going to end up in disaster. And because we don't need something that is covering up and layering over. What we need as a practice, and it's quite different from other practices as well, but we need interior design to come on and actually appreciate and understand where we've got to, and quite often using the architecture as the interior,
Right.
because the volumes are created. Now there are some architects who will stop at the blockwork, and they won't. We're not that type of practice. So actually, probably a lighter touch on interior design and using and understanding the values that we've already created is what I look for. And I think also it's just people who get on, because actually I think one needs to remember is this is most of our clients, they're not doing this because they just need to put a roof over their head.
No.
They actually do it because it's meant to be an enjoyable experience, and we like to make it an enjoyable experience. So working with an interior designer, they need to know, and we need to know how we're going to work together. We need to get on, and we need to take that client on it's a really wonderful journey, because they're spending money, and we want everybody to enjoy it. And I think if that enjoyment manifests itself in the result, I think we've done well.
Yeah. And Natalia, how do you, presumably you all feel that your architectural training has given you an extra insight into how the interior design works. Your understanding of space and materiality is
for me, it's all grounded in my architectural practice. And very often in my projects, people come to me for a vision, and I will bring an architect on board. And depending on how I'm feeling, I'll either bring a very collaborative, creative architect that I want to work with, somebody, like my two colleagues on the stage who do beautiful work, whose work I like and admire. Or if I really want to control the process, then I'll bring on a technical architect, and then we lead it. So I don't have one approach. It really is project specific. And I think we do have to identify that there is tension between architects and interior designers. And it doesn't happen as often in my practice and I employ a lot of people who are architects, even though they're working more on interior design, because of how it's my own foundation. So it's a comfort fit for me. But there is tension because and when we're all talking about a collaboration, which is great when it works, but when there are architects that are very dogmatic and care more about form and are not focused on how clients are going to live, because there are those architects and who are much more interested in their name than in the livability of a project, or a designer who's also dismissive of the role of an architect and doesn't understand that if you can't build it, there's no point in having the idea. Yeah. So I'm constantly trying to arrive at a place where we don't have that friction, and really it's responding to the needs of an individual project, even more than the client, but how that works together. Because I think we can all agree the worst thing is a project where people don't get on and then you don't have a great result, which doesn't happen very often, but if it does, it's not a good one.
Yeah, definitely. And this idea of livability, I remember years ago seeing one of those interior design programs, and they were showcasing an architect's house. And at the end, there was an interview with his wife, who was sitting upstairs in the children's bedroom. And she said, "I come in here because it's the only place with curtains." People, and it probably isn't true of most architects, but there is this idea.
It's true of a
lot.
So
how do you navigate that? Because actually, a bit of softness, houses, their homes, they were people. They need to make people feel nurtured.
It is an interesting topic, because actually I've worked a lot for the Newt in Somerset, which is a hotel, and we don't have curtains there. and my client, who is Karen Bruce, is also an interior designer, and she's an amazing stylist. She doesn't like fabrics and curtains. So how do we get around that? We actually create very architectural spaces, but we have to control light. So we use invisible blinds, we use shutters, and the result is probably harder. But actually, it's a very appreciated aesthetic. It's a very uncluttered aesthetic, and actually, it is all about the materials we're using there. And
Because it doesn't have to be cold. I mean,
it is certainly not cold.
Yeah.
It's very warm, but then the warmth comes from the textures that we've already put in, be they bits of relics from previous buildings or stonework or timber work, and that is the architecture. And then the interior pieces are placed very carefully inside that. It's still livable.
Yeah.
But it's a different approach. I'm just trying to use it as an example of the no fabrics doesn't necessarily mean cold and architectural.
No, indeed. But there can be that idea that, actually this house is all about the architecture, and actually the architect would prefer probably that nobody lived in it. So it remains...
That's never true. That's never true of me.
Possibly by having a practice that sort of does both, maybe, I don't know, you avoid that.
I mean, definitely. I love curtains. I love fabric. I think that they just, layer. But I think it's very fair to say that if you look back at history, Frank Lloyd Wright built in all the furniture because he didn't even want his clients to have their own taste in furniture. Yeah. I think a lot of architects have that perception. But I think this is when, and I think maybe the fact that the three of us are responding when you're doing private client work, which is not for us. The success of your practice is based on whether or not you can make them happy, and then they recommend you. And I think most people actually do like to live with an element of coziness. However that looks, it can look very. Richard's beautiful projects and Claire's beautiful projects, they're all different stylistically, but as you say, it's about materials and layering it. So I think the best businesses represent the vision of their founders or of the people who run them. This is my approach, which is a very holistic one. And hopefully that resonates with the people who hire us. Hospitality is very different. And then you have a lot more factors, I think, at play. And it's interesting what you said about the newt, because I'm working on a hotel where the client said blinds are not enough. And we need, because we have clients from from countries that they like to sleep with a little bit of lights, and others that like complete blackout. So hospitality has opened a whole new conversation for us from a design point of view, because you have to address the needs of so many people in one room.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we come, I want to hear about, you've all three recently completed really fantastic projects, which we'd like to hear a bit more about. But you mentioned just earlier, Claire, about how these definitions change in different countries. So I'd just be interesting to, because you all work internationally, it'd be interesting just to hear how it's different.
Yeah, it is different.
Europe.
I mean, architect the role of the architect is a protected title. And in Europe, there's more weight to that. For example, in most of the continental Europe, you can't, for example, submit a project for planning without being an architect. Whereas, for example, in the UK, you can you could feasibly submit a project for planning, get consent, build it, and not even involve an architect. There's potential issues with that. But so there's the issue of the title, but then there's also the conception of then there's the sort of architect, interior design. I mean, sometimes I think even in the US, and Natalia probably know more about this, sometimes you have, we were looking at a project where there was an interior designer, a designer on top of that, and that is probably, and then an FF&E designer. So sometimes and depending on the scale, there's categories for the people who are going to do the sort of shell and the space planning, then somebody else who's going to look at the kind of finishes and the materiality and colors and lighting, and somebody else who's going to come along and do curtains and art and cushions and velvet sofas or whatever it is, and then somebody else who may also be coming to do, wall lights or other sort of fixtures. So it does sort of vary, but I think traditionally in Europe, the architect is the person doing the shell and the core and the main sort of kind of solid building structure. But I think it is very much changing in that it's going to become. In fact, the lines are sort of becoming more and more blurred. Right. I think between them.
Okay. And have you found that? I mean, what about in the States? Natalia, you did a lot of work.
I mean, in the States, there's a very clear, I think, distinction between interior designer and architect. And I think it tends to, maybe because Americans love having a name, so they like having an architect with a name, and they like having an interior designer with a name. And I think very rarely do I see practices where the two are very linked. but you know, I think there's nothing worse than a team with 27 different, you know, creative.
Well, like I
I've
say,
never heard of them.
categorically, I wouldn't work on
No,
a
I
project
wouldn't do
like
that. Yeah, it sounds
Absolutely no.
horrible.
But again, I think it's quite progressive in this country that it is different from a lot of continental European countries. I mean, I worked a lot in Spain where the architect's role was him and he was absolute god. Whatever he said went, and then people had to work around that. Well, that's not necessarily very helpful either.
No.
So I think being able to sort of blur the boundaries and actually find, I mean, Natalia was talking about in her practice, she can pick a very technical architect to help her. And I think that, you know, that allows that boundary to move between interior and architecture. But personally, I would never work on I would run a mile if I had to work with so many people, because I think one can lose the vision.
Or be a
Yeah.
technical architect, Richard, because you obviously have an aesthetic and your own creativity
But
that
we
you want to
technically
express.
produce that.
Of course, but you wouldn't want to just do a technical role.
No, of course. But
No, I
then the
get it.
technical role is what then creates the building, which creates the
Makes it happen.
You know, that makes it happen, and that is actually the experience that people have of
Yeah.
architecture.
Yeah.
So
Of course.
I think trying to define it and put it in different boxes.
Yeah, I think it's hard because I always struggle with the idea of, because you don't build buildings as an architect to just look at from the outside. You build buildings to inhabit. So internally, so you're inside, you're in the interior of a building. And by definition, that I think implies that interiors has to be part of architecture. And it's sort of, you know, the surface treatment. For example, I mean, if you look historically, you look at like Baroque architecture, it was all about decoration and opulence. Or even if you look at architects like Victor Horta or Gaudi, what they built was architecture. But it was, I mean, 100% sort of, I mean, there was no need for anybody to come in and place interiors into their projects, because it was decorative. And these are, you know, these were architects who were designing. They were thinking about the doorknobs. They were thinking about the glass. They were thinking about the furniture. You know, like Natalia said with Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, because sometimes there's nothing worse as an architect to sort of pull away from a project, and then sometimes your sort of client comes
Absolutely.
in and nothing works with the space, and you sort of go, oh, this is but you know what can you do? But, so
Well, what do you do? Because that must happen. You know, you design this, you create this beautiful space, and then they come in.
I think because the process goes on for such a long time, personally, I don't really have that shock, because I've already got to know the client, and then that trust builds up. But I have to accept that people have, taste is very subjective.
Yeah.
And they might have come to me for the building, but actually, you know, I'm not going to tell people what art they should put on their wall. I might offer my opinions, and I do quite a lot of that. But actually, at the end of the day, people choose things because they like them. And also, I think another interesting topic that we could go into is that a lot of people come with stuff already.
Yeah.
And interior design isn't just about, you know, buying
Clean
stuff
slate,
and fitting out. All my clients come with a history and baggage and
architecture is also about that. I mean, even if you're building them a house, they still have a way that they live, and you know.
And the psychology of people is fascinating. And there are no two clients who want to live in the same way, and no two lives are going to be the same. And I think it's actually quite refreshing when people come with stuff. It's quite frightening of people to throw everything away, because then there's a real onus on us as designers to replace it with something.
Yeah. So how does that process begin? You know, your client approaches you, says, I want, you know, I want you to create a house for me and a home for me. How does that?
Well, quite often we will start talking to them about, sometimes it might be a key piece of art or something. Sometimes they want you to present ideas on the table, and sometimes you have to weave in. I think, as Rich said, sometimes it's a shame if you're starting from scratch, because I think having parameters is always helpful. And sometimes they may have an incredible collection of, I don't know what, that they kind of want displayed, or they really want to, you know, revive these old pieces of furniture that they inherited from it. And I think that's always really good. And I think, you know, we always try to be able to create not a house, but a home. And I think there's a difference. A home where you can have, you know, contemporary pieces of art, but you can have something old, and that there's a sort of blend of things that can fit together. But it is, it's a journey, and as Rich says, quite often these projects, they go on for 18 months, sometimes 2 years, and you get to know things, and things evolve. But to sort of understand who they are, what their ambitions is, what their baggage is as they sort of arrive, and sometimes the physical things that they might have and bring to a project, which are, and sometimes you might sort of work a room around a piece of art if it justifies it. Yeah. So, you're building a narrative and a sort of, it's all a bit of a theatre. You're building a stage set for their lives, that is going to make them happy, I think, ultimately.
And often do people probably bring stuff, even if you're building them a new house, designing them a new house, it might start with the sort of, maybe that they have an architectural vision, but often it's probably more about their lifestyle or their belongings that drive it. Would you say that was true, Richard?
I mean, I think there's a reason why people choose different architects and different interior designers, and we have lots of clients who will go around a sort of a swatch of studios and talk to people. And I think the first thing is a sort of is there a rapport? Is there an understanding? And because we don't all get on with everybody, and certainly for us, because our projects, you mentioned a year, 18 months. I mean, some of ours are 5 years. Wow. And if one has to go through a long planning process, then these projects can be tense. So people come and choose us, and it is like a sort of a temporary marriage, and they get to keep the house at the end. and I think then there's a lot of listening and understanding, and some clients open up, some just they don't know how to open up, so we always find different ways of getting information out of people. I mean, I had a client recently who really couldn't quite understand where their aesthetic interests lay until we actually asked them to open up their garages, and we found sort of incredible cars, and they started talking about design of these cars. And then suddenly we're having a design conversation, but they didn't even realize they could talk about design. Okay. And looking at people's books is also a very, very, very good way. And I think also not everybody's design literate. No. And most people don't understand plans. And actually taking people on this journey and we still employ a lot of hand sketching. I hand sketch everything by hand. And we have this sort of mantra at the end, no shocks or surprises. So we have to illustrate really carefully all the way through. And then they can react against that. And within my team, there are people who are not architects, who actually will sit there and observe reactions. And we have to there's more than just listening. It's just feeling where people are coming from. And then testing them a little bit. And it's an interesting process.
Yeah. And is it similar entirely on your projects when you're maybe not, you're not designing the fabric of the house, you're not building them a house?
No, but inevitably we're involved in a building process. Whether we're leading the architecture or not, we are involved in the process. And I find I'm always focused on what the client's vision. I'm sitting here thinking about how many of my clients bring a lot of stuff. And in my practice, it's not that many. And I think it's because I have a very young client base, perhaps. I work with a lot of people to do their first homes. Okay. I seem to have this wonderful...
Well, next time around, they'll have stuff.
I know they'll have stuff. They'll have a lot of stuff, which I love. I love it when they have a wonderful collection of art. Like it less when it's not a good collection of art, but I've worked with that too. And I never try and impose judgment on their personal taste. I just say, okay, well, we'll make it work because it is their home. But yeah, work with young guys in the age of 35 to 38. And no girlfriends. They're a great client base. They love your vision. Tell me exactly where to put it, Natalia. No, that sounds silly. Although this bathroom I'm showing you is precisely for a young man with great taste and nothing. And that's where we try and inject history and buy lots of beautiful pieces with history and character to bring it when they don't have it.
Yeah. And what about hospitality? You've all worked in hospitality, Natalia. Your first hotel is just finishing now.
Just finishing.
How is it different? And obviously we've heard about the farmyard at the Newt, your project, and you've worked on hotels. And so how is it different? Is there more interior design than architecture, or?
See, sorry, do you want to?
No, go ahead.
I
you
would
go
say
first.
it isn't different, but then that's probably because of the type of client that we have at the Newt, that they are a private client, they're two people, and so I'm not being commissioned by a board or a company, and therefore they are projecting their character and their vision onto what they're doing. So I don't think that actually designing that is any different. Now some people could go there and not necessarily like that taste. Well, then they can choose a different hotel. And that's why there are so many different destinations. And I think, like, clients choose their architects, and clients also choose their hotels and their restaurants and their fashion and we find it very interesting looking at the places people go on holiday, the restaurants they go to, places they buy their clothes, because I think it's all part of a lifestyle.
Sure.
So
I think it's interesting because I think although it might not be different, I think potentially in hospitality it is more important, because I think any sort of hotel operator will tell you that the sort of, and especially in the sort of day we live in, that your sort of your experience of being in the hotel is everything. And a client who has a really good experience, people are looking for experiences these days, and it's and so how they feel, and the sort of physical built environment that hotel offers and the interiors are going to, in the physical way, define that experience. So I think it is incredibly important that works, whether it's to the person's taste or not. But I think, this day, in a sort of day of people go on holiday and they kind of Instagram images of their sort of, and everybody's sort of very visually stimulated, but the whole experience is really important. And it's possible that, having a really carefully curated interior on a home it's not a necessity. For example, I mean, you can do up a home and move in, and and bit by bit, you go to IKEA, buy yourselves, it's possible, right? And a family can live. Whereas you cannot open a hotel without the sort of, the beds and all of the kind of various components. So, when a hotel opens, it has to be sort of like, wow, kind of, it's going to define the experience. I'm not saying it needs to be, you could have kind of quite a kind of pared back hotel, but at least it needs to be thought about and done. You can't forget that component and open a hotel, I think.
And there's a very clear vision, isn't there? There is more of even a theme, with a hotel. In a sense, you're creating a sort of fantasy environment. Whereas
but I think that's up to the architect and the interior designer to actually create that, because certainly at the Newt, there was no brief.
Wow. Okay.
So we were part of that evolution of the brief. And I also have this saying that actually a home and a house is a hotel for life. And actually, people do visit lots of, as you say, we live in a very visual world, a very experiential world. So our clients come with all that sort of information. Yet they're going to spend it on something that's going to last them for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think that, for me, it works back and forth between
Right.
hospitality and residential.
Right.
So I have found it very different.
Yeah.
I've approached it very differently, because my brief was to create a very glamorous, slightly theatrical, sexy space, which isn't how most people live. Most people don't live in rooms that are entirely covered in red velvet. And I've really allowed, actually, could be great. So, I've really let my imagination run wild, with the benefit of an incredibly trusting and adventurous client, for whom I'd done a number of projects before we did a hotel together. And so it's been a lot of fun, because I think the comfort and all of those livability factors are a given in a hotel, right? They're a given. They have to be there. The beds have to be comfortable. The sofas have to be comfortable. But I love going to hotels that are an escape. They're not aspirational, right? Aspirational is something different. That's like, I'm in this space and I want to elevate my own home. This is, I want a sexy weekend with my good-looking boyfriend, or I want to go away with my girlfriends and, drink champagne and sit in a leopard print covered room. I think those and it would maybe get tedious to live like that day in and day out. But how fun to have your senses triggered in a different way and pushed in a different direction. So when I was looking at the hotel, I sort of threw away the rule book of how I am focused just on my client and on the livability and the longevity that we've been talking about, but really what is really going to push the buttons. And also the most important thing is, sexy lighting, so everyone looks beautiful.
Yeah.
That's essential. Like it's also, how do people look in the space? How do they walk through the space? You can do an all red room, because when it's full of people, that actually doesn't look so red, but everybody looks great against that color. So it's been really fun to do a space that is transitional
Yeah.
and provocative.
The difference is
Yeah.
beginning to show now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. And I want to come back to that idea. Maybe we'll do it first. Has what people want from a hotel changed since the pandemic? And this may be me, because I haven't been to a hotel in 2 years. The idea of going to a home from home appalls me. I want to go to this space. I want to be in a fantasy. Do you think it is changing in the way that the pandemic made us so focused on our homes as places of sanctuary and refuge and things? Do we now we can go out again? Do we want something really different? Have you two found that?
Gosh, I mean, you say hotels are not aspirational, but I always think, and again, I don't think I stay in enough hotels, but I always think that you want to be inspired, that if it is not a place now, it might be different, but if it is slightly not more exciting and better than your own home, then you might as well almost say. So you definitely want to be kind of excited. You want to kind of go around and go, and I mean, I can't stop myself going, wow, look what they've done, and look at these chairs, and so I think people, but I think people like to escape. It's like sort of travel. It's that you're taking yourself from your sort of daily life and whatever your sort of home looks like, and just going to somewhere that inspires you. Makes you sort of think differently about the world and your environment. And I think I think the whole point is that the space you're in can trigger emotions, and if they're sort of positive emotions, it's like if you're going to go into space and it's neon bright kind of light, and then you're not going to feel sort of happy. Whereas if it's maybe it's a wonderful red velvet room where the lighting is great, you can behave differently, and it can make you happy. I think
But escapism and aspiration are slightly different, because actually I agree with Natalia that people don't necessarily aspire to live in the places that they escape to. Yeah. But actually you can escape into places that are that provide you with the right emotion, but all they have are very good values. So I mean, I can only speak for the Newt, because that's my only hotel client. But there it actually goes beyond just it's not the interior, and it's not the things you sit on. It's not even just the rooms that you're part of. It's actually then goes on outside that. It also then goes to all the other experience on that.
Explain in case people don't know what the Newt. I mean, it's an incredible site, isn't it? It's farmyard.
It's a 800-acre estate in Somerset. It was very run down, and it was bought by a South African couple who also own a hotel called Babylon Storen in South Africa, and they have a very, very strong vision of what they want to create. This is centered around gardens, landscape, history, experience, food, and those ethics spread all the way through. So everything is, for example, our remit is everything needs to be local and crafted. So we are not, the lavishing of luxury materials brought from the other side of the planet is not what that's about. And I'm not saying that's a wrong thing in certain places, but there it's actually, you're in Somerset, and that's what we're creating there. So we're buying our stone from a quarry a mile away. We're using English limestones in all sorts of different ways. So that ethic is all about the ethos and their vision. So they're investing into the local economy. They're creating a world. I mean, this concept even takes people from Paddington on their own carriage down to Somerset. So you actually go to a very sort of wonderful rural escape, and that's what it is in its many sort of facets.
And
there we go there.
And it sounds amazing, and that's the brief. Whereas mine was a hotel in central London, in Mayfair, which isn't about the outside. It's all about the inside. It's about wanting people to have a unique experience that maybe they haven't felt before. I mean, the Newt sounds ideal, and when you go to a country hotel, that I think that is what you want, and it's so, that contextual connection between the landscape and the materials is important. I do have to say, I hate hotels that feel like You know, I don't want to be in a Shanghai suite in London, and I've seen them here. I mean, I do like design that feels like it makes sense where you are.
But there's a difference in talent, isn't it? Because actually, here we are talking about architecture and interior design. You know, we're talking about London, where actually, you know, it's an internal experience.
Yes.
Whereas what we're doing, you know, we're very privileged at a lot of
internal.
our projects. It's not just an internal experience, because actually the view is amazing, and you can walk outside, and there are some of the buildings that exist are amazing. So whereas your brief is much more internalized and it needs to be in London. So they're very different projects. So quite difficult to compare. I think.
Very, very different.
But
briefs.
also yours, although it is an internal thing, you know, you are in London, and you were saying, you know, that idea of you go into this room and suddenly you're in Shanghai. I don't know, that's an odd thing.
For me, it would be odd, and I don't think anybody would hire me to do that. And if they did, I'd say, you know, I don't know that I'm the right person, because I think you have to be honest about what you're capable of doing. You know, this interior that you'll see from me at the 22, I'm not saying it's a quintessentially London interior. I don't think they'd pick the Cuban American girl from Miami to do that. There are other people who would do it a lot better. But it is what, you know, maybe an international person would say, let's do color, let's do materials, let's be, I keep coming up with the word sexy, which I'm sorry sounds very trite, but I think it should be really sexy, and that's what we were trying to achieve. And it is about that, interior space. And I think all spaces should inspire you, back to your point, Claire, about, you know, in comfort, and I want my home to feel comfort and cozy. But I think it's nice to have, going back to your question, which is, have people changed their desire post-pandemic? I think people are sick of being in their houses, so they want to do something different.
Sure. And Richard, you mentioned about craftsmen and material. In this discussion about, you know, where architecture and interior design sort of sit, do you do a lot of commissioning of crafts people?
Yes.
You do.
But I think that is ingrained into the architecture that we do. And I think it's also, every practice is different, but our practice actually provides architecture that's going to last. So actually there is time to invest into that craft. And for me personally, it's something I'm very interested in, and I think it's very important. So yes, I think that craft then, and here we're talking about values. So if our values are things need to be local, or they're sustainable, or they're crafted, and they're unique, well then that needs to carry on with what goes into the interior. And I think that's where, you know, if the match is right, it can work really well. And that's where, if the match is wrong, it can go horribly wrong.
Yeah. And Claire, do you commission craftspeople and to make furniture and?
Yeah, I mean, it usually sort of out of necessity, because we can't find things, and I think it's really an interesting and enjoyable experience. And sometimes sort of designing a dining table can almost take you as long, the sort of back and forth, the engineering, than designing a sort of whole kind of basement and a swimming pool, because, you know, it's complicated in itself, but it's quite rewarding. I think in our practice, from a sustainability point of view, we're trying to sometimes revive, recycle, and it's hard, because, you know, people's aspirations are for interesting things. But yes, we work with different kind of workshops. Sometimes they're in Norfolk. They tend to be perhaps not so much sort of London based, but you know, I think we're always sort of trying to look for trying to get our clients to invest in very good quality materials that can age, and that the age, we're just trying to convince them that actually it's okay for the material to age, and it'll age gracefully, sort of, you know, or people get very concerned, but, you know, will that stone worktop, will it sort of stain, or will it chip? It's like, yes, it will, and that's fine. It will, you know, it'll get its sort of pattern of age, and that's sort of, that's fine as well. So, but all of the materials that are well crafted and cared for you know, I always think the energy you invest in sourcing out those materials, or sourcing out the craftsmen, it always shows in a project, I think. And it's you know, if you've got the good clients that understand that and are willing to commit, I think it's always there's always a lot of value added to a project in that.
And Natalia, do you also commission?
All the time. And in fact, I prefer always to source locally, because, as Claire said, you know, each piece of furniture that we design, each sofa that we do, is a very long process. of trying to get it right, and I like to be able to go to the workshops and see the frames and see the material. I also, I consider my company, we're a small business. I like to employ other small businesses, and I like to have, so there's an element of control, there's an element of ethics for me. I very much, I don't really love machine-made things. I love things that feel crafted. I love things that feel imperfect. I love things that feel tactile and homemade, handmade, and texture is very important in my interiors. And so, you just get that with someone who's been making, a certain type of furniture for generations. And then also from a practical point of view, it doesn't delay my projects to source locally. I don't have furniture stuck in the Suez Canal like happened last year to a lot of designers because, so I think there are so many reasons for focusing locally on having things made and, to keep it all going.
Sure. So it seems, I mean, listening to the three of you, and you are all architects as well, that there sort of really isn't, you can't see where this line is, and that may be something to do with the way that you work.
I think there is a line.
But there is
but it's a different line for each of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, okay,
and
so
we
it's
all
a very
know where that
blurry
line.
line.
I
But
mean, we're all being very polite, but we all know what that line is.
Okay, come on then. Just before we end, where is your line? Where is your...
Well, I think that line is actually, this is not some sort of, project isn't between architect and interior designer. It isn't I hand over the baton and the interior designer does the final stretch and wins the race. It's actually collaborating and actually having that overlap that then the interior designer comes on board, working with the same values and the same way that we work, and employed in the same way, working for the client in the same way. I think that's where my line is.
Okay. And who if it's a hierarchy, if it's a vertical rather than horizontal, what's the hierarchy?
Look, I think for us, we are the leader on these projects. We come in first, and we're there way after it's finished because there are tedious things with buildings. There are defects periods there, and we are responsible for all of that. So we do have that long-term involvement. So I have to say, I think.
I'm not 100%. I don't agree entirely with Richard that there is absolutely a line and we all know where it is, because in my head I've become more and more confused about where that line is. So, but what I do think is that I think more and more people are emotionally engaged. They're very emotionally aware. They're very emotionally aware of their sort of well-being, and I think the people that understand that if they sort of nurture their environments in the same way that they nurture their body and eat healthily and go to yoga, and that if they're nurturing their environments and that can trigger sort of positive emotions, then I think that anybody who is invested in making good architecture and good interiors, it's got to be a great thing, regardless of what the definition of architecture or interiors sort of is, and yes, the architect might sort of be the first person on the job, but sometimes, when we've worked on projects where the client came with their very own interior designer from Belgium to do a project in London, and actually the interior designer, we had a very collaborative relationship with them, but they sort of led because they were the sort of client kind of it was a little bit like, this is my guy, right? Can you work with him? And it was fine, and it worked really, really well. And the ownership was sort of somewhere in between. So I think, look, I can't find the kind of hard line in between personally. But I just think anybody who values the doing both things and doing them well, it's got to be a good thing.
Okay, Natalia.
I lead all my projects. No, there's one though, or not. No, the truth is, but it might be a personality thing. It might be, as I said, people come for what's the look, and then I choose the right people to play with. But I would love to collaborate with an incredibly talented architect who had a great vision. For me, it's about respecting the vision and working with people who I respect and who I want to learn from, and who push me to be a better practitioner of interiors and interior architecture, whatever we want to call it at the end of the day. But I think I do understand, and I think why my practice has veered more towards the interiors is that for a lot of people, especially in London, when you aren't doing new builds, or actually, even in the other cities that we work in New York, we're always working in Spain, we work in Miami, we worked in Switzerland. It's because people understand they can bring a picture of this is the sort of room I want to live in. And it's harder for people to do that with architecture and see how they can impose their personalities, because sometimes, especially publications and the way architecture is showcased, it's very often, I'm sure everyone can poke holes in what I'm about to say, so just go with the train of thought and then we can tear it apart after. But a lot of architectural photography is, and I see it on architects' websites, it's very often, good angles which show the architecture, not how you're living in it. And so, people who come to me want an interiors-led process. And so that's why we end up being the leaders.
Okay. I mean, I think what we all agree on at the end of the day was what we were trying to do is create beautiful spaces that feel, good to be in. So let's finish on that nice positive note. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Absolute pleasure.
It's such a pleasure.
Fascinating. What a fascinating session. Goodness me, we've been to all sorts of projects, from the 22 to the Newt, nurturing relationships with clients, nurturing relationships with artisans, with the environment, which is, I think, something, Claire, you said, and of course those shared values between architects and interior designers. The meticulous care and attention you take as designers and architects is extraordinary, and I think we're all astonished by the work that you do. You really do create spaces that inspire, and I really want to thank you for an absolutely brilliant session this morning. Let's give them another round of applause.
Thank you.